So I think I'll put the longest title of presentation I've ever done. So I thought we'd look at complex diabetes, foot disease, and developing effective care pathways for the detection and management of diabetes, foot complications, the role of nurses and podiatrists, the MDT. So I thought I'd do it again. For me, bringing probably the two presentations together, I'm always fascinated to listen to Christian from his role, and I'd love to have him in our team because the difference they've made at King's is immense. But certainly the foot in diabetes, it's all about looking at the risk of the patient and the risk to you. It's important to share that risk, and one of my key messages, probably through the talk, is timely referral. So why do feet go bad? Pathways, data and evidence and outcomes in the next half an hour. So one of the key information is a patient, if they've got a callus, a blood-stained callus, is a significant risk to them. And for this patient, where you can see the extravasation into the tissue, is a risk factor increasing that chance of an ulcer by 77%. So that's an immense increase, but what does that mean to a patient? So it's really key, but it's managing that patient and trying to prevent that foot from ulcerating. Excuse me. We've heard from Christian about amputation, so it's every 20 seconds a lower limb is lost to diabetes somewhere in the planet. And David Armstrong has recent data to suggest that every 1.2 seconds somebody develops a diabetic foot ulcer somewhere on the planet. So I think we're against a tsunami of patients coming towards us. Living well with diabetes is key. There's 8,760 hours in a year, and a patient may only get a fraction of that time with one of us. And it's really important on how we empower them, how we try to influence their decision making to understand their diabetes and understand their foot requirements. And it's very much that team game involving others. Christian touched on it, the foot survival, or the patient survival with diabetes, foot ulceration and or amputation varies between 50 to 75% mortality at 5 years, which is a significant aspect. And when we talk to patients, even those most non-compliant patients, they sort of shrug that off and say, oh, well, it's not going to happen to me. But looking at our data through our MDT over the last 3 years, we're rising up our mortality rate, unfortunately. Looking at the data, Marion Kerr is a really good source for this. You can Google her. She's done loads of work on this and shows that length of stay increases with patients with diabetes. And 1 in every 33 patients with diabetes have a foot ulcer. Southampton has a population of 250,000 people, so that's about 13,000 patients with diabetes. So between 2.5% to 5%, so that's between 300 and 600 people today walking around with a foot ulcer just in Southampton. The average healing time is 12 months. So why does the foot develop so many problems? So foot ulceration, the prevalence data there. So at any one time, 68,000 people in England. That's a sizable town of people. And there's 3 types. There's neuropathic, ischemic, and a growing number of neuroischemic as patients get older. And what does that look like? So I showed Stephen this picture at lunchtime when I asked him to come along, and we just wanted to talk these through. So put up 3 pictures: the classic neuropathic foot ulcer on your left, the middle a neuroischemic, and then an ischemic toe on your right. And we had a debate about these, didn't we, of what started it and what was the cause.
And I wasn't particularly impressed. I think the foot on your left. It could be purely neuropathic, so the patient could have palpable pulses, but they could have significant peripheral arterial disease. The patient on the right could have palpable pulses because they've lost that toe from infective or inflammatory vasculitis from the infection. So you can't really say whether a patient is ischemic by looking at the wound. You need to assess the patient, you need to assess the limb and assess the neuropathy.
So Christian touched on this a little bit in his presentation, but looking at the complexity of our patients that are coming through, they have so many things aspect in there. And as mentioned in my previous talk, the BMI of our patients is quite high in Southampton. But certainly there from depression is a real key aspect and one that isn't addressed, and we've got very limited psychological support for these patients. Their motivation, being male, is a real risk factor because predominantly 90% of our foot ulcers are male patients for this population here. And not knowing their risk from that annual review is still an ongoing issue. The patients don't know their foot risk. But for me, it's very much time to get these patients into the right pathway, to get them. Don't feel that you need to manage these patients on their own. We still get patients who are managed for a period of time, and then it's the old, oh dear, something's gone wrong, and we need to ship them on. We'd much rather see people really early with a very small wound that we can offload, do everything to resolve, not until the foot is in a situation that I have to make the phone call to Stephen and say help. And that was really highlighted in the study across Europe that showed that foot in diabetes, the biggest enemy was the delay in referral into specialist teams. This patient comes up quite a lot of this picture. So we know the annual foot check is there. It's part of GP about primary care. They have 20 minutes to half an hour a year with a patient to do everything around their diabetes, and we ask them to do a foot check. Look at their neuropathy status and their vascular status, and to convey that foot risk. And we know patients' feedback, yeah, I've had my feet checked, or no, I went in and they asked if my feet were okay and I didn't take my shoes and socks off. But that will give us the indication of the traffic light system as from NICE of low-risk patients who have normal sensation and good pulses, no previous ulcer, no foot deformity, but present a callus, but with no other risk factors. And that makes between 60 and 70% of the population of patients with diabetes. Then we go up the risk stratification to the moderate risk. We have a loss of sensation or absent pulses, signs of lower limb peripheral arterial disease, previous vascular surgery or foot deformity and callus. And those are the patients who should come into a foot protection team, depending on what's commissioned locally where you are providing your care. And then we've got the high-risk group, are those previous ulceration, previous patients have amputation, renal replacement therapy patients, they're a growing number and their feet are incredible risk. Those ones who have really evidenced PAD and neuropathy and callus with extravasation and so forth. And then we have our really acute foot that comes into the top end of the pathway. At this point, we're just dealing to preserve what we can at this level. So looking at active foot ulceration, spreading infection, critical limb ischemia, and then certainly from our MDT, work very closely with Stephen and his colleagues, diabetes team, and with our orthotists. And then we have access into virtual diagnostics, primary care, limited psychological support and so forth. That shows a nice risk triangle as published by Young back in 2009, looked at the stratification of a population of patients with diabetes. I believe that our moderate risk group is our greatest group, but it's bigger than the 15% of the numbers that are out there. This is an example of what's commissioned for us locally. So we look at moderate and high and acute foot within podiatry and Solent. And this is a range of foot ulcers that are presented over the years for us. The patient at the top, both left and right, is the same patient. We were amazed because he presented with putting his feet on a radiator, and he presented 2 days after Valentine's Day, so he came with a nice heart-shaped wound for us. I think we were more prepared to get a nice picture than looking at the rest of him. But it was key to get that tissue burden off the wounds and to manage him. But all those patients have an HbA1c way above 100. What's our highest so far? What's the highest you've seen, Stephen, in our...
Well, I think it's quite a sad story. A young lady who came in with an HbA1c of 254. The second highest was, I think, 167 or something like that.
Right.
So,
Didn't think we could go that high, but yeah, wow. So it's a real pause for thought, isn't it, about these patients? So, and these are the type of patients that are coming into our MDT. So it's looking at those patients, a new foot ulceration, or those patients that aren't progressing on, probing down to bone, who aren't for conventional treatment responding, that need that secondary sort of view, that team dynamics, that pit crew. I was going to ask which character you were in the pit crew, but
I've never been in a jumpsuit.
all right. So we like to see our Charcot patients coming in, and then any follow-ups of patients who are coming out that we don't know about out of hospital. As Christian identified from his presentation, Charcot Foot is a drastic incident into the foot. It's limb-threatening and a real challenge for a patient to manage. That rocker sole and all that pressure going through the sole of the foot over that one location, it's a high chance of ulceration, high chance of infection, high chance of limb loss. So how can we improve outcomes? Public Health England has a really good data set that you can go look on fingertips. You get your CCG breakdown of all your diabetes, your care processes, and diabetic foot is one of those aspects. And you get a data sheet, looks at your length of stay, your amputation rate, both minor and major, and your incidence of foot admissions. And put up the demographics across Wessex, so that's Hampshire, Isle of Wight, and Dorset, the amputation rate. So we've got our majors and our minors. So you can see there's quite a variation, and we're quite high across the country, across the local health economy. What's your views on the relationship to majors and minors? What's your looking at the data, Stephen? Putting me on the spot.
Yeah, it's my major headache. We run a very high minor rate, and we have until 3 years ago had a national average major amputation, which wasn't too bad. But over the last few years, the most worrying feature is that our majors have been going up and our minor amputations are going down, which to me would suggest that we are not getting patients in early enough, that we're not picking up the problems. So the high minor rate would suggest that we don't have the support in the community to offload the patients to prevent them getting the toe damage. But the swing in the risk in the minors going down is that we are now getting delays and we're picking up a higher major, which is our big concern.
So I would, if you're interested, go back to yours and have a look at your data and see what it looks like. So what are the key challenges to face when treating a diabetic foot patient? So we know that it's a complicated lesion. It's late referrals we talked about. Offloading, only a small percentage of our patients get appropriate offloading around looking at the gold standard total contact casting, or getting offloading to the offloading device that you can remove. It's ensuring you've got a local treatment to reduce the variation across there, continuity across the pathway, and good communication between all stakeholders and providers. So standard of care in diabetic foot ulceration today. So I've sort of stolen this slide. So this is a really nice slide that shows the 5 key areas. So not the fact that we only offload the second toe and we only assess the infection in the fourth toe, but looking at assessment of perfusion of ischemia, assessment of infection, metabolic control, offloading, and then evidence-based wound care. In NICE, there's very limited support for evidence-based wound care up to recently, and there are very much recent guidelines, systemic reviews, only a few published of high quality, and the majority are susceptible to bias. The positive existing data on neuropathic DFUs or mixed neuropathic and non-ischemic DFUs for skin substitute and growth factors, and to date there's no device or drugs with a demonstrated efficiency, efficacy in neuroischemic diabetic foot ulceration. And you've probably looked at and seen the Explorer study that got published earlier last year in the Lancet, which was a double-blind pan-European study, and really showed the implication of optimizing the 5 care pathways, the 5 key elements, to ensure that offloading, but looking at a evidence-based wound care product. And out of that has come a diabetic foot ulceration pathway, which was a international, well, European one from the Explorer study, and we've put it into England, and it looks at 3 pathways coming down, but it's about early referral, getting those patients coming in early. One of the real big aspects there, we wanted to focus on the high-risk comorbidities. So there's heart failure, end-stage renal disease, and then depression, as Christian has touched on. And then looking at how these patients, once they come in, they follow the pathway. So you have a non-complicated, a complicated, and then a severely complicated DFU. And we'll just go into a little bit detail about what those mean. And we touched on the IDSA guidelines in the first presentation. So looking at a pathway for these patients, what that means. So fundamentally, we use SINBAD, which is an acronym for Site, Ischemia, Neuropathy, Bacterial Area and Depth. And it gives you a scoring system. And it's a scoring system of 0 to 6. We use SINBAD in the National Diabetes Foot Audit, so it's a communication tool, but it's also a predictor for healing. So if you've got 0 to 2 risk factors, it's a moderate ulcer. It should heal in 77 days based on INT's paper and cost the NHS £4,000. If you've got 3 to 6, it's severe, so it jumps up from 126 days to 577 days and costs £17,000, as Marion Kerr described. So if we take an example of our nice toe that we've talked about in the infection today, what could we score that as? Anybody wants to take me through it? It's been a long day, hasn't it, for you all? So what is it? It's on the forefoot, so that scores 0. Had palpable pulses, so that's scores 0. Neuropathic, I'm pretty sure that's neuropathic, yes. Bacterial load, do you think it's infected? Yeah. Is it bigger than 1 centimetre squared? Yes. Is it probing down to bone, capsule, tendon? Yes. So score that 4 out of 6. So that's a severe, complicated foot ulcer. So that will take considerable amount of time to heal, unless intervention has happened, as we talked about in the first presentation. We also use the Texas classification, which gives an indication of it's A, it hasn't got infection or ischemia, B, it's infected, C, it's ischemic, and D is both ischemic and infected. And then going from your left to right is the depth. So on your right is down to bone, and on your left is just ulcerating or just healing. So putting all that together, we should have a nice pathway that we can follow for these patients as long as we get them into a specialist pathway, a specialist team, or that MDT review. That can be a presence MDT or a virtual MDT, but you're sharing that risk. And it's about sharing that risk, that risky patient, with as many people as possible. We've touched on offloading in quite a detail, so I won't address that. We touched on infection. Debridement we've looked at. And just to show you from a debridement aspect is really key to ensure that you've got adequate debridement. And then ensuring that you've got adequate perfusion coming into the foot. So from your experience, Stephen, from a vascular point of view, putting me on the spot again, I'm going to get so much pressure when I go into what sort of if you've got a patient who presents with significant vessel disease, what could you do for that patient? What are your options? What's in your armoury?
Again, it's always individualized to the patient what their requirements are, what we're looking at trying to heal, what are their risks. But generally, we will try non-intervention, well, as little intervention as possible, so angioplasty where possible initially, reserving the bypass for failed angioplasty or ones where they're not able to angioplasty, and ablative as the last resort.
Okay. Thank you. And as we touched on that, metabolic and holistic management of patients, and we know that suboptimal diabetes control brings on poor healing and poor outcomes. Low motivation, low mood will bring on poor outcomes, and can also, on the flip side, all contribute to progression to early amputation. So debridement we've looked at, and then just looking at significant heel ulcer. For a patient who's got type 1 diabetes on dialysis, quite a young patient, what would your SINBAD score be for this? So location would be heel, so that's 1. Are they ischemic? Does it look ischemic? No, it's got some. Has it got potential to heal? The history behind this was he wore a pair of shoes a couple of weeks before this and blistered his heel. So he had rapid deterioration. Is it infected? Yes. Is it neuropathic? Yes, because of the dry skin. Area greater than 1 centimetre? Yeah. And depth? It looks pretty deep, doesn't it? So a 4 to a 5 until we debride it. So Stephen uses the Versajet a lot. I've used it over the past, and we use the Versajet on this gentleman. So you can see the bridge of tissue there. And then just taking that away with the Versajet, just removing all that debris with ease, well, relative ease, to create a nice wound that we could use topical negative pressure on. And 13 weeks later, we got to closure, which is fantastic. But as a preventative, this patient had 1 foot ulcer. Chance of re-ulceration in 12 months is 40%. So the prevention strategy for him is looking at really good emollients, good skin quality, that urea-based cream to keep that, and that surveillance, and then orthotic provision and footwear.
Just one, can I cut in there? Just
Yeah.
from a dialysis point of view, hind-foot ulcers generally associated with 70% amputation rate in dialysis patients. So extremely high risk. He was a lucky sod.
He was. And he's quite, to just share with him, we're in a football stadium. So he came down, he used to come down with a friend of his who had a Charcot, and they used to come to clinic together. His friend was a Southampton fan. No, his friend was a Portsmouth fan, and he was a Southampton fan, so he'd love to be here today. We saw him on a Friday afternoon. If he needed to be admitted, he would have to go to Portsmouth. And Portsmouth Southampton got a bit of rivalry. He'd rather die than go to Portsmouth Hospital to be admitted. So it was very much looking to try to keep his individual needs met, but also trying to keep him away from his arch enemy of Portsmouth, because at the time Southampton and Portsmouth were in the same league. But I'm not a football fan, but even though we're standing in a football stadium. And we've got a lovely beach being made out later for you, so you can go out and sit on the beach there. So just to round up the last few slides, is we contribute to the National Diabetes Foot Audit. How many hands up are those who are contributing to the National Diabetes Foot Audit in the room? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's great. So the uptake, it's been running now 4 years, I think, 4 or 5 years. So the uptake has been relatively small because there was an aspect about seeking consent. But the National Diabetes Foot Audit does show, and it's not really a rocket science, it shows that patients who are seen within 2 weeks to a specialist team are alive and ulcer-free longer or more than those patients seen late. So they look at 2 markers, they look at 12 weeks and 24 weeks. And they know that the average sort of patient is type 2 with a male who's 67 years old and had diabetes for 15 years. So it's really key to look at those patients and contribute to these. So if you can go back to where your place of work is and ask, are we submitting to the National Diabetes Foot Audit? That'd be really great. So in conclusion, diabetic foot ulcers are challenging and can be a major impact on a person's life. Managed predominantly by podiatry, and if not, they should be in a pathway. Share that risk. NICE national guideline is a great documentation to read. I would download it tonight, go away and read it tonight. It's a great read. Have it to hand. Really use evidence-based pathways. Once healed, at 12 months, a 40% re-ulceration rate. But the shocking thing, at 5 years, 90% of those foot ulcers will come back. So for your homework, and there will be a quiz tomorrow, know your local diabetes data for outcomes. Know your local data for diabetic foot ulceration, because it's lovely to know that we're seeing everybody in the pathway. Ask for the diabetic foot pathway. Early intervention within 2 weeks shows higher rates of being ulcer-free and alive than those seen later from the national diabetes, and better outcomes will reduce amputation rates. So that's your homework for tonight. And then just as a resource, if you want to look at additional resource, there's a special interest group called the Foot in Diabetes UK. The membership is free. You can as part of that, you can get the Diabetic Foot Journal that comes out every quarter. It's a really good resource. And we have an annual FD UK, Foot in Diabetes UK conference November as part of Wounds UK. Thank you very much for your attention.
We've got time for 2 or 3 questions if anybody has anything they want to ask the group.
It's a question for Christian, if I could.
Oh, are we switched on?
Well, I'm there. Sorry. You were talking about mainly surgical interventions for
Christian.
Sorry, yourself.
Stephen.
Apologies. No. Yeah. So you were talking about surgical intervention for the majority of the ones that we looked at. Do you use anything like the PMMA beads, the gentamicin beads, if you've got gram-negative infection?
We haven't used that a lot, no. We've started using a little bit of Cerament into the osteomyelitic bone, stimulan with antibiotic mixed in gentamicin, vancomycin, one patient colistin. So not a lot of it at this stage.
Right.
And that's just our inexperience more than anything else, I think, at this stage.
Because it's used a lot abroad, isn't it, in America?
It is used a lot. We're still not 100% certain of the efficacy, cost ratio benefits and that sort of thing.
Okay. And the other one, if I could, just quickly for Graham, in previous presentations this afternoon, we've had the same thing with IAD and pressure ulcers. Can we not get more creative than just having grade 1 to 3? Or grade 1 to 4?
1 to 4. I think. Yeah.
Right, the next question, just quickly on, if we could, please.
I know you got your AGM.
Yeah. Oh, no. Go on, no.
I'm one of the tissue fibrillatory nurses from Southern Health. Hello, Graham. Hello, Mr. Baxter. I've had a patient in my patch that you've both seen very recently who is having dialysis. He's also diabetic, very dreadful black heel. You saw him, you gave him antibiotics, you didn't do any other intervention and you sent him home. So he's got this black heel, hard eschar. This might be a really basic question, so I apologise if it is. It's just starting to go a little bit soft. And the question is that because it's starting to lift and do we leave it? Or do we start thinking he's diabetic, renal problems, is there underlying infection, and does he now need to come back to you? And we see a lot of this, and it's that, what do we do?
What stage, I would say...
heels are always difficult. Dry eschar, we tend to leave.
Yeah.
If it's looking a little bit red on the edges, it's a bit boggy, I would tend to debride it. be a
Right.
bit more aggressive.
Okay, because
Yeah.
at the moment we're just trying to keep it dry, and obviously we're keeping a very close eye on him.
Yeah.
But it's interesting what you said, that the 6 weeks, if there's no improvement, to come back. And I'm just thinking, I don't want to get to 6 weeks with this man.
we're much. I would. We've changed that, so it's now 4 weeks that we within
Right.
the team. If you're not seeing that improvement in the European guidelines says if you optimise care for 4 weeks, you should see a 50% reduction. If you're not seeing that, you do something different, and then involve that team. Yeah.
I'll ring them first thing tomorrow morning.
Right.
We've time for just one more question. We've time, but I'm sure the guys are going to be around this evening, so I think, yeah.
Sorry, Jill, we're actually out of time. Sorry.
Oh, so
That's all right, I'll collar
you'll
them
colour
later.
them later. Okay, I'd like to thank them all very much for a really informative presentation. Thank you.